Hi, I'm Amr Iqbal, and today we're talking about my favorite topic, corporate innovation. So, let me start with a question. Who can tell me what this is a picture of? If you answered the Wright brothers, you would be correct. You would also demonstrate that you can read the words on the screen. But of course, this is a picture of one of the most game-changing moments in human history, the Wright brothers performing the first human flight. So Wilbur and Orville Wright conquered human flight on December 17th, 1903. And if you think about what they achieved, they actually changed the course of human history. The way I like to put it, it was very understandable. A dude got into a box and turned into a bird. It was like magic, right? But here's the issue. Nobody actually reported on this in the news media until 4 years after the first flight. There was one interview around about that time with a so-called industry expert who was a hot air balloon tycoon who said, you know what, human flight, it's just one of those things. It's probably not possible. Maybe in the way off distant future we can have some version of it, but it's just not really feasible. Now, this was a full year after the Wright brothers had already completed the first flight. So it brings us to a real issue here and the first problem with innovation. Innovation is hard to see. Often we see this gap between a game changer occurring and people recognizing that the game has been changed. And so what we see from the Wright brothers story is that even people who were there in Dayton, Ohio, they saw it with their own two eyes. They said, well, this needs to be some sort of a trick. They can't really be flying, right? They were first-hand witnesses. Now, even experts, not just regular folks, often make this mistake and fail to see game changers as they're occurring. So when the telephone was invented, for example, Western Union owned the telegraph lines, and therefore you would have said they were the industry leaders in telephony. They said, nah, this telephone, it's never going to be a real thing. US Congress issued a memo when the automobile was invented saying, yeah, you know what? Automobiles will never replace horse and carriage. It's just not going to be feasible. So again and again throughout history, we see these examples where so-called industry experts fail to see the game changer occurring in front of them. And that's a problem. The second big problem with innovation is it happens gradually over time. So Andy Jassy, the CEO of Amazon, back when he was starting up AWS, Amazon Web Services, he talked to the difference between invention and innovation. One of the myths in the innovation game is around this light bulb moment where a moment of inspiration comes along and it changes the game in and of itself. But that's much more to do with invention than it is to do with innovation. And so Andy Jassy talked about that journey. In the early days of Amazon Web Services, companies wrote it off. They said, well, this is kind of a cute little toy. Maybe startups will use it one day. It will never be suitable for the enterprise. And it was years until cloud computing was taken seriously. Fast forward to today, there's not an IT department on the planet who doesn't have some sort of cloud infrastructure or planning for their cloud strategy. So clearly, innovation isn't a light bulb moment. It happens gradually over time. Finally, innovation requires us to change. And this is possibly the biggest problem with innovation. We measure and incentivize innovation in all of the wrong ways. We've seen examples of things like innovation bonuses. You're trying to incentivize innovation, which is a long-term, generational, quite a messy thing, in the same way that you reward salespeople who can quite directly correlate action A resulted in result B. It's just not the same thing. So we're looking at innovation in a lot of these cases in totally the wrong way. Similarly, we hear a lot of talk from corporates around embracing failure, fail fast, fail forward. There's a lot of talk about it and talk around it, but in terms of really putting your money where your mouth is and embracing that at a corporate level, we still see very few examples of where this is being done well. And so all of these things are tough to do, we understand, but without actually changing ourselves, we have no hope of changing the organization, and therefore it doesn't serve the innovation agenda. So, 3 key problems with innovation. Innovation is hard to see, it happens gradually, and it requires us to change. Form huge stumbling blocks and explain why There is so much churn around the innovation industry, and we hear so much talk about innovation theatre. They are hard hurdles to overcome, but they're not insurmountable. And here's where we come to the 5 ways to innovate. So this was a piece of analysis, a framework that was born out of some work that I did a few years back in my consulting days with my team. We analyzed close to 100 different companies and looked at all of the various different ways that companies are innovating. Now, it's true, there are hundreds of different innovation approaches, all with hundreds of different names. But when we really started to look at the overlaps and find the commonalities, you can explain about 80 to 90% of the corporate innovation approaches using just 5 key buckets or key categorizations of innovation initiatives. So I'll walk you through those, and then at the end we'll talk about the strategy. So the first really common one that we see are upskilling programs. We want to be a more innovative company, therefore let's make our people more innovative. It directly tries to tackle the problem at the heart, and what we see this manifesting is internal universities, agile training programs, rolling out large-scale certification, basically building up those capabilities within our own workforce and our own people. Now, these can be great because they tackle the heart of the problem, but equally what we often see with these in terms of a limitation is rather than actually leading from the front of the industry, what they tend to end up doing is bringing up the rear. The second common one that we see are innovation hubs. So we've all seen a version of an innovation lab. If you've ever seen in your office people walking around in jeans and black t-shirts and there's some room with bean bags and a beer fridge somewhere, you know what I'm talking about. Most corporates on the planet have some sort of an investment in a hub or a lab of some description. Again, they're good because it means we can start to attract the type of talent that we need in order to be a more innovative company. We can start to attract technologists and entrepreneurs and design thinkers and this sort of talent and put them to work on really tomorrow's business type problems. But one of the biggest challenges that we see with this is how do we cross-pollinate the outputs of these innovation teams back to the core organization? And as we know, every organization on the planet has an immune system to change. And this is where we start to see some of that resistance come up when it comes to actually taking the great outputs from the innovation teams and incorporating those back into the core. The third one is possibly one of the most interesting, and it's one of the more recent ones that we've seen come up. We call it a startup studio. So this is where a company says, well, the goal of innovation is to build the business of tomorrow. So why don't we just go out and build a startup, build a venture right now that could potentially become the business of tomorrow? And usually it's not just one venture, there will be multiple ventures, but it directly aims at building the business of tomorrow. We understand that we possibly don't have the capabilities to build those kind of startups, so we're going to bring in some external help from consultants and other types of external capabilities. But they will effectively be like a venture or a startup operating within the umbrella of a corporate. And so these are quite interesting. Again, they solve for the problem of let's build tomorrow's business. But some of the limitations that we start to see is, well, what about all of those people back in the core organization? Sometimes they can feel a little bit left out in the cold when it comes to the innovation agenda. And equally, we can start to see the core organization sometimes imposing some of the processes, technologies, some of the limitations from the core onto these ventures rather than just letting them operate as startups as they probably should be free to do. The fourth one that we see are incubators, and we lump accelerators in here where you've got early stage or later stage startups basically housed in an external environment. You bring them in, you give them some funding, and you let these startups do their thing. It's great from a de-risking failure point of view because the corporate isn't looking at it as, hey, we're failing. It's looking at, well, they're just startups doing their thing in their own environment. The tricky part can be when it comes to making investment cases, and we've seen a lot of these incubators fall down maybe 2 or 3 cohorts in where the board is kind of saying, okay, well, we played around with some startups a little bit, but what did we really see in terms of immediate financial gains? So again, that the ability to measure and understand the long-term impact of these innovation initiatives can sometimes be the downfall when we talk about interacting with the startup ecosystem. And speaking of ecosystems, that kind of is the fifth play that we see, which is the most passive, which is Typically, when a company says, well, we'll set up some sort of sensing and scanning capability, we'll look at all of the IoT or all of the fintech startups that are operating out there. We'll assess them. Maybe we'll partner with a few of them to build some POCs. And then eventually we'll see where rubber hits the road and we can make some investment decisions around acquisitions or partnerships or the like. And so this is the most passive version. It's great because it's very low investment upfront. You only invest where you need to, but it's also a very long-term and a very passive view, which for a lot of corporations, they may feel that they need that sense of control rather than just sitting back and letting the market do the work. So we just talked through the 5 ways to innovate, and here's where it starts to get interesting. When we lay out those 5 ways to innovate across a spectrum, what we see is a real pattern. From the left side, where we see upskilling and innovation hubs, it's a very invested innovation approach. We're going to take on the innovation agenda internally with our people and build the capability from within. At the other end of the spectrum, we see a divested innovation approach. Let's sit back, we'll be a bit more passive, we'll let the market do the work, and then dip in opportunistically when the time is right. And now making decisions around this are very, very important. Laying down the principles and strategic decisioning around, as an organization, do we want to be in the driver's seat of building tomorrow's business? Do we have the capability? Are we honest enough to say, hey, we will keep up the investment and keep ramping that up over time? Or are we better off taking a more divested approach, because that's probably not something that we can bite off right now in a big way? Let's let the market do some of the work and then reassess as we go. These sorts of decisions are really, really critical and often aren't taken seriously enough when companies are embarking on their innovation approach. And the final piece I'll say on this framework is the most successful innovators treat innovation like a portfolio. So the first question I get asked when I present this is typically, well, sure, there are 5 ways to innovate, but which is the best way to innovate? And the answer to that is, well, if you look at the most innovative companies on the planet, they're not just investing in one of these 5. If you look at Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, these companies are investing across all 5 ways to innovate. And in fact, they have multiple bets and multiple initiatives across each of those 5. If a company is going to have any hope of succeeding in their innovation agenda, it really needs to look a lot more like a portfolio. And our guidance typically is any company who's serious about innovation should be playing in at least 3 of these 5. And you can use a spread investment decision like a 70, 20, 10, something like that to spread your bets across a portfolio. But just making one bet is rarely the way that companies succeed in terms of building a successful innovation operation. Well, thank you. I'm going to leave it there. My name is Amar Iqbal. I hope you've enjoyed this talk and you've gotten something out of it. If you want to stay in touch, please feel free to visit 5waystoinnovate.com, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.